natin sa buong mundo na ang Pilipino may kakayanan na magpahusay ng kabuhayan Pilipino.
That we call on all patriotic Filipinos to discard ideological differences, party affiliations, disparity of religious beliefs and regional origins, to close our ranks, stand behind one flag, commit our honor, dedicate our lives to fight as best we can in defense of our country.
Ang ating katipunan. Ang ating katipunan. Ang palatuntunang maghahatid sa inyo ng mahahalagang impormasyon tungkol sa mga kaganapan sa loob at labas ng bansa.
Ang ating katipunan.
Magbibigay liwanag sa mga katanungang nagdudulot ng pagkalito sa mga mamamayan hango sa aral ng pandaigdigang kasaysayan.
Ang ating katipunan.
Makikinig sa inyong mga daing at kuro-kuro sa pagsusuri ng mga kasalukuyang suliranin ng ating bayan at ng buong mundo.
Ang ating katipunan.
Maglalatag ng kalutasan ng mga sanhi ng paghihirap ng kalagayan at kabuhayan ng sambayanan.
Ang ating katipunan.
Ihahatid sa inyo ni Itos Valdes ng Philippine LaRouche Society at Partido Politikal ng Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino kasama si Cathy Cruz.
Sa hudyat, 2 minuto makalipas ang ikapito ng gabi. Philippine Standard Time, ngayon po ay araw ng Linggo, ika-23 ng Hunyo, 2024. It's Sunday evening tonight and June 23, 2024. Ang himpilang ito ay kasapi ng KBP, kapisanan ng mga broadcaster ng Pilipinas. Magandang gabi mga katipon sa Pilipinas at sa buong mundo. Ito po ang inyong katipon, Cathy Cruz, na inyo pong makakasama sa loob ng 2 oras. Kasama pa rin ang Pangulo ng Katipunan ng Demokratikong Pilipino, walang iba kundi si Itos Valdes. Magandang gabi sa iyo, Itos.
Hello, Cathy. Good evening po sa mga tagapanood ng ating Katipunan. We're here again tonight, 7 to 9 p.m. Simulcast over RMN 558 and on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Rumble, and on Facebook. So all our channels are still active. Please like and subscribe to us to get the latest also. So good evening everybody tonight.
Yes, thank you Itos. And of course, tonight ang pag-uusapan po natin ay the new international economic system or forever wars. Alin ang gusto ninyo? So mamili ka. Sabi nga ni General Luna, mamili kayo. Di ba Itos?
Yes, actually we have a special guest tonight who will be joining us right in a bit. Our longtime colleague, mentor, friend, and ally, and fellow fighter for the new renaissance that we want to happen in the world. And I think it's perfect to have him here tonight. Mike Billington will be joining us in a bit to discuss the great and beautiful transformation the world is currently in now, and the bright future that we can look at if we choose to do so. But first, Kat, I wanted to discuss since we put out that video, no sumali kayo sa Schiller Institute na press con, di ba? Tapos nakapagtanong kayo ni Ver. That video of Scott Ritter, Colonel Wilkerson, at there's one more, Richard Black.
Yes.
They all answered the question regarding the Philippines, and it has been spread far and wide locally. Ang dami na nag-pick up ng news na yan all over the Philippines. From the mainstream media to the alternative media to the social media, bloggers, and continues to be spread all around, not even just the Philippines, but even around Asia. And particularly some outlets I saw in China, China news outlets. So this is a very important and beautiful intervention na ginawa natin, di ba, Kat? And may reactions na nga locally, di ba? Parang may what happened. Remember, since then, since that Scott Ritter answer, when they answered the questions, there had been an immediate escalation. There was an altercation, maybe 2 days after, 3 days, 2 days after that interview was spread, altercation again between the Coast Guard of China and the Filipinos, and there was a back and forth kung ano yung what happened. Una, sinabi nila some media outlets and some claims by people within the defense establishment claimed that China again was the aggressor. But then after that, they changed their tune and said that it was just an accident and it's nothing to write home about. But there are others also, Cathy, di ba yung sinasabi mong generals, former generals,
Yes,
do you want
General
to say
Pokis.
something about that? Yeah.
Isa po yun sa itos sa naging magandang epekto, no. Yung mga retirado nating mga militar, no, nagkaroon ng lakas ng loob na ilabas yung katotohanan at ilabas na pero mo from the military itself, makikita natin na meron pala mga ganito mag-isip na katulad ni Scott Ritter at naiintindihan yung nangyayari. And one thing na talagang natutuwa ako sa nangyari, nagkaroon talaga tayo ng napakagandang oportunidad that night na nailabas natin ng mahusay yung tanong natin sa totoong nangyayari sa ating bansa. At nasagot ito nung mga panelists natin, si Scott Ritter, si Senator Black, at of course si Wilkerson, di ba? At makikita mo, Itos, na parang ito yung nagsimula para bumukas yung pintuan ng katotohanan. Sabi mo nga, kukunin ko yung parang isang wall na natibag natin, nagkaroon tayo ng konting siwang na nabiyak natin yung matibay na wall, no, na pader na halos hindi natin ma-penetrate ng totoong balita yung talagang nangyayari, maisiwalat, maipaalam sa mga taong bayan.
Right, the wall of propaganda, or the wall of mainstream propaganda here, we were able to penetrate it by this intervention, again by giving the ideas and truth to come out, and people respond to those things, and it shows that shortly after that, and I don't know if this is connected, but it's also impossible to say it might not be. Shortly after that, our Vice President, Sara Duterte, resigned all her cabinet posts by this administration. So it signals a shift, a big shift in local politics. So this intervention was huge, first by the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche organization, which has always been at the forefront of interventions in behalf of mankind and humanity.
Correct.
And our collaborators here in the Philippines. What a breakthrough. It changed the whole narrative, and I think Mike will be perfect to discuss these things moving forward. But first, before we bring on Mike, I'd like to give the latest LaRouche update by our colleague and collaborator Harley Schlanger via our YouTube, the LaRouche organization YouTube. So let's watch that first before we bring on Mike.
Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for June 21st, 2024. In a world in which events are moving with incredible rapidity, and one in which you're deprived of knowing what are the actual dynamics underway, it's important to be able to have somewhere to go to have your questions answered. And for those of you who are new to the program, I try to use Fridays to take questions and comments to address the concerns that people have, especially as we live under a censorship dictatorship, which doesn't allow the truth to come out in the mainstream media. It doesn't always allow our stories to get out either, as many of you know, because there's a policy of the social media to censor views, and sometimes it's hard to find us. However, I am committed to using the Fridays to take your questions, and today's Friday, so I'm going to take some questions. I'm going to put them into two different sets. First, several of you asked, why did Putin go to North Korea? What came out of Putin's trip? Why was this so condemned in the West? Well, you have to go back to June 14th, when Putin spoke at the Foreign Ministry in Russia. And what he did is review the whole circumstances behind the Ukraine war, how it's changed the strategic situation, and his proposal for achieving peace. But what he identified as the problem was the unwillingness of the transatlantic region to accept the fact that there's a change in the world. That is, they refuse to accept the idea that nations have a right to legitimate security concerns. In this case, they rejected the idea that Russia had legitimate security concerns. And so he said it's necessary that there be a change in this kind of thinking. And he said this is unstoppable. One aspect of this is the creation of a new Eurasian security architecture, which is based on addressing the interests of every nation. Now, what he talked about is that you have the emergence of such institutions as the BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and these are not merely a question of military power, but of cooperation for economic development. But when you're dealing with the West, he said, you have to take into consideration that the West is prepared to go to war to defend their unipolar order. So you can't ignore the military threat. However, what he did with North Korea was to adopt and sign a strategic partnership, which includes military and economic cooperation. Now, interestingly, he left North Korea and went to Vietnam and did the same thing there, much to the chagrin of the unipolar advocates in the U.S. State Department. What is necessary to realize is that they're already moving to this new economic partnership. 60% of the trade between Russia and Vietnam is now conducted in national currencies, not in dollars. So when you recognize that this is the change in the world, and then add to that the Ukraine war was made to weaken Russia, to allow the continuation of a bankrupt system of predatory looting. So they're trying to cover unsustainable debt through a looting process. Well, this is what we've always warned about, that LaRouche talked about this for many, many years. One example of this was his creation of the idea of a triple curve as a device to understand what's happening. That is, you have monetary aggregates going up through the roof, you have financial aggregates that are even higher, and you need money to back it, which is the cause for inflation. At the same time, you have the productive curve collapsing. And this was an idea that LaRouche presented, which was picked up by some leading Russians, including Sergei Glaziev, who's a leading Russian economist. Glaziev just put out a statement recently saying that the endless supply of money pumping is not endless, it's reaching a limit, as in the triple curve. And Glaziev said this will lead to a collapse which, quote, threatens to develop into a full-scale social and economic catastrophe on a global scale, unquote. That's what Putin is addressing with this idea of the need to establish a security architecture which includes recognizing the economic interests of every nation. This is why Helga LaRouche has referred back to the idea of the Peace of Westphalia, where the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe in 1648 led to a treaty which was based on the recognition of the needs of the other. That is, that you only have security when you're concerned with providing similar conditions for those who otherwise you might go to war with. So the question is, will the West change policies without a blowout? Well, that's a question that has to be posed to you. But that brings me to the second set of questions I got about the European parliamentary elections. Was this really a victory of the far right? What does it mean? There's still bad governments in power. There seems to be no change. And one from England wrote, Starmer is no better than Sunak. You still have the same elites. There's no difference. Another question, what will it take for real change to occur? And then there were several of you who wrote, forget it, change is not possible. The only way things will change is for there to be a crash. And the final question in this said is, you call for the West to join the BRICS. Won't that subvert the BRICS? Well, here's the answer I have for you. There's a global awakening underway, a recognition that the present system serves only narrow private interests, and there's a need for a change. Now, how does that move from just a general recognition to an actual system which reflects a solution? But the global awakening is real. It's everywhere, especially in the global South. You have to go back to 1955 and the Bandung Conference of the Non-Aligned Movement to realize that the real fight against colonial policy goes back, in this case, 70 years. Now, colonial policy, imperial policy existed for over 600 years. We're coming to an end of that system. And there's an emergence of voices now in the global South more determined than ever to break out of the colonial policy or the neo-colonial policy, the so-called liberal democratic policy, to achieve true sovereignty. And this is involved in the change in dynamic, which Putin has been talking about, which is why it is that the U.S., despite all its blackmail and financial power, military power, is unable to get the world to accept its policy of an all-out war against Russia in defense of Israeli genocide in Palestine. It's not working. The credibility of the Western unipolar order is gone, and the dynamic of a new multipolar order is taking over. So what did the European Union parliamentary elections show? Well, in a sense, we're seeing an attempt to reshuffle the deck chairs on the Titanic. Does it take sinking of the European Union for that to change? Well, it might. And if we have to wait for a total global collapse, as Glaziev said, it'll have catastrophic consequences, not merely hunger, disease, but more wars, more chaos. So the question is, does the human race possess the capability to act to preempt the worst consequence? Because if it doesn't, what makes you think that a collapse will lead to something better? Now, what that means is that we need what Helga LaRouche has been calling for, a cognitive leap in the population. That governments must be forced to respond to the legitimate demands of the population. And it means that we have to overcome the brainwashing. We have to recognize that a big part of the brainwashing is to convince people that you have no alternative except to submit to this order. That's been the whole reason for the domination until recently of the global South, that countries that tried to resist, such as Libya, such as Iraq, such as Syria, were subjected to intense pounding and psychological warfare and blackmail. We see the same thing going on today in Georgia. with a regime change coup underway. We've seen the same kind of threat to South Africa with the loss of the majority by the African National Congress. But this is a fight that's underway, and nations are fighting back. So the real question for us is, if we can avoid being exterminated by thermonuclear war, do we possess the capability to fight for truth and solutions? Now that's what the Schiller Institute is involved in. That's why we see this not just as a question of economics or military, but a cultural question. Does man actually possess the capability to act for his true interests? And that's one of the reasons we have been convening every single week the International Peace Coalition, to have a discussion of the strategic situation where we bring in experts who are cooperating with the discussion to take up the real crisis and what the solutions are. I'm going to have a link to today's International Peace Coalition Zoom meeting, which any of you can join. There'll be a link in the description section. Join the call and take these ideas to others. The answer to your question, can we do this before the crisis exterminates us, is what will you do? So take our offer also to subscribe to the Executive Intelligence Review Daily Online Alert, and you can get it for 1 month free. So the question is up to us. We can determine whether we live in times of global dictatorship, that is the era of the twilight of sovereignty, or whether we can organize a peaceful end to 600 years of imperial domination. It's up to you and your friends to join us to make sure that happens. Put an end to this global dictatorship.
All right, that was si Harley Schlanger po, member of one of the heads of the LaRouche organization, together with Helga Zepp, giving us an overview and also a sense of responsibility, putting us on humanity to make that decision and to help craft the new world economic order, just economic order, and to help us discuss this even further. Please welcome. It's good to see him again. Our good friend, our good old friend of my father, Butch, friend of the family, friend of the organization, and friend of the Philippines. A real true friend of the Philippines, and a long-time collaborator for a new just world renaissance. Please welcome Mike Billington. Nice to see you, Mike.
Very good to be here. Thank you, Itos and Cathy. Let me ask you something. Is the Valdes chorus still performing?
Yeah, well, we haven't been able to perform together for a while. We lost our tenor, and then the other tenor is in London now. So, but we'll get right on that soon enough again.
So people know the Valdes children formed a chorus. When I was in the Philippines a couple of times, I worked with them to help them, learn some classical pieces and some canons. And when we were singing internationally, when we were organizing choruses all over the world to sing Dona Nobis Pacem, which is a very simple but beautiful canon that's been around for hundreds of years and often sung by Christian movements around the world, calling for peace. Let there be peace, Dona Nobis Pacem. And that they performed that on tape, which got circulated all over the United States and around the world. Very beautifully done. Itos and his brothers and sisters have very fine voices and were able to convey, I think, the power of beauty, of great music as a means of awakening in people, what Harley was talking about when he said it's up to us, the people, to awaken ourselves in order to get the world to change, to respond to this moment of crisis of civilization. So perhaps you could put that video up on your website, Carlos, so that your followers could get a chance to watch your family singing that beautiful canon.
Right, will do, Mike, will do. So go ahead. I'm sure you have an opening statement, and we can jump off from there.
Well, let me say, you've already referenced this dramatic intervention that you and Cathy made when we had this historic press conference on the 14th. I believe it was the 14th. No, it was the 12th of June. And Scott Ritter and Colonel Richard Black, many of you know him if you've watched our videos, and Colonel Colonel Wilkerson, the former aide to Colin Powell, who during his time as the top aide to Defense Secretary Colin Powell was himself part of the effort that started the war against Iraq, that launched these horrible genocidal wars across the Middle East, and afterwards acknowledged that this was a horrible mistake on his part, that it was based on lies, as everybody now knows, based on the lie that there were weapons of mass destruction when there were none in Iraq, but that was the launching of the neoconservative policy of forcing the maintaining of the unipolar world, to make sure that no threats emerged, especially in the Middle East, where they recognized that the Middle East had been set up historically by the British, both in the creation of Israel as a cockpit of war, both in terms of maintaining constant, perpetual hatred and warfare between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but also as a means by which basically every country in the world was told, you have to take sides in this fight. You have to be on the side of the Israelis, or you have to be on the side of the Palestinians. It can only be one or the other. And in that way, basically using the Middle East crisis as a cockpit for war to maintain the battle against the Russians and the Chinese, and basically against the whole global South. So, of course, as you know, with the genocide taking place now in Gaza by the Israeli IDF, the whole world has recognized the horror of this policy from the US, because this would not be happening without the full backing from the US of the Israeli genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. So that's now recognized, and as a result, the Israelis are very rapidly becoming hated by the world for what they're doing, and absolutely rejecting. And the U.S. is following suit. The idea that the Biden administration is directly, personally responsible for maintaining the arming of this genocide, providing the weapons being used for the slaughter of innocent civilians, mostly women and children, has turned the stomach of most of the world's population. And the identity of the United States is declining just as rapidly as the identity of the Israelis in the worldview in the global South. So that is, of course, only one of the wars being fought right now. The war in Ukraine has reached a turning point in the sense that it's clear to the world that Ukraine has lost that war. that the intention of the war was never Ukraine. The U.S. and the NATO forces that follow U.S. and British policy never gave a damn about the Ukrainian people. All their talk about defending democracy in Ukraine, people know that there's no democracy in Ukraine. You're not defending democracy. In fact, you may have seen that just this week, the U.S. officially changed its designation of the Azov Brigade, which is the foremost of the openly Nazi organizations, the organizations founded on the basis of Stepan Bandera, the collaborator of Hitler in Ukraine, whose policies are now glorified by the Zelensky government, by the openly supporting the neo-Nazi movement, wearing their swastikas. The U.S. has now declared that they've searched and investigated the Azov Brigade, and they've determined that there's no human rights being abridged by the Azov Brigade. So we no longer will deny them military support. And in fact, it was just revealed this morning that as long ago as December, the Azov Brigade was being trained by U.S. and Polish and other NATO forces, openly sponsored and supported and armed. This was back in December, so long before the U.S. officially declared that it was no longer denying weapons to the Azov Brigade. They were already involved in arming them, and basically the move to turn Ukraine into an outpost for the revival of fascism in Europe. And of course, the intent here is what they openly declared is to destroy Russia. They don't give a damn about the fact that tens of thousands of Ukrainians are being slaughtered in this war, which cannot be won. They're just cannon fodder in what they hope would be a destruction of Russia, being waged hand in hand with sanctions, a massive number of sanctions being imposed by the US and the British, and then imposed on the rest of Europe, which of course was destroying Europe. You have now in Germany, for instance, the once great industrial power of Europe is now a collapsing hulk, deindustrializing, energy prices completely out of control as a result of the U.S. bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline that was bringing in cheap oil and gas from the Russians to Germany and to the rest of Europe. And instead, they're being forced to buy LNG from the U.S. at I think, double the price or more than double. I don't know the actual percentage, but it's leading to the destruction of industry across Europe and especially in Germany. So, excuse me. So, I mean, essentially, we're in a situation where this Ukraine war is lost, and the danger is that the U.S. is so hysterically committed to maintaining its position as the world's only superpower, the phrase that they so proudly declared when the Soviet Union fell apart back in the early 1990s. People like Paul Wolfowitz and George Shultz, people who, of course, had a horrible record in the Philippines, which we could discuss if you'd like. But they were responsible, those two in particular, were responsible for the EDCA coup in 1986, which overthrew the Marcos regime and basically destroyed the development policies that had been implemented through Marcos Sr., who, and unfortunately, as everyone now knows, his son has shown that he's not going to follow in his father's footsteps, but is taking orders from Washington to turn, as you have very clearly stated, and as Scott Ritter and Colonel Black so eloquently stated in response to Cathy's question during that press conference, that basically the Philippines is being turned into the Ukraine of Asia. They're going to use it as a proxy war against Russia, against China, the way Ukraine is against Russia. And of course, this would not only mean a war in Asia and the decimation and destruction of the Philippines, but it would massively contribute to a new global war. That this would be an effort by a U.S. which is now a collapsing economy, morally collapsing, a degenerate nation, a nation with a culture which is based upon drugs and perversity, and economic disintegration, and this is where things are heading if this is allowed to happen. So I'll end this opening statement by just again commending you and Cathy for that eloquent question that you provided to the press conference, and which led to Scott Ritter and Colonel Black and Colonel Wilkerson from their response, basically warning the Philippines that America is not their friend. The American government, or at least the government under this administration, is not their friend, but they will use the Philippines down to the last Filipino the way we're using Ukraine to the last Ukrainian to carry out the effort to destroy the BRICS and the Russia-China cooperation expressed by the BRICS, which is in fact mobilizing the entire world. And you have now 85% of the human race either directly working with the BRICS or following the BRICS ideas and choosing development and the Belt and Road rather than sanctions and war under the guiding hand of the City of London and Wall Street.
Right. Okay, Mike. Thank you for that. I wanted to have a follow-up question first on that. You mentioned a little bit about, you mentioned that you might want to expound a bit on the Schultz, involvement in the Philippines during that time and what their intention was for Asia, because it seems now in hindsight that their intention was to create what is now commonly known in which is becoming more common, is create an aircraft carrier situation to make the Philippines an aircraft carrier of the U.S. in Asia, and they had to take Marcos Senior out for them to do so. Is that a fair assessment during those times?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you know, the Marcos was declared by the Western media and the Western governments to be a vile dictator who was imposing dictatorial rule on a hateful population that hated him and so forth. This was just a total lie pushed by people like Wolfowitz and George Shultz, who was the Foreign Secretary of Defense at the time. Foreign Secretary of State, and Wolfowitz is his deputy, and who were working with their assets within the Philippines to build up an opposition movement, the first color revolution. It was yellow, as you all know very well. In the case of the Philippines, it was yellow. But this was really, I mean, except for what they had done to Iran against the Iranian government earlier, this was the first of the so-called color revolutions, where the population was mobilized around phony human rights issues to undermine development. The truth of the Marcos regime, Marcos Senior, was that he had built up through his, I think it was called the 11 development programs, a massive development policy. It included nuclear power. It included food self-sufficiency with a Masagana 99 policy. It included building steel industries, transportation networks. At that point, the Philippines was admired across Asia, especially in Southeast Asia and the ASEAN countries, tremendously admired as the most developed country in the region. It was a model to be followed. Imelda Marcos built the Heart Institute, which was being used by people from across Asia who came to the Philippines for this excellent medical care. And that Ferdinand and Imelda were reestablishing very close ties with China, with Iran, with other countries that were at that point the beginning of the demonization taking place in Washington against these countries as part of their building the unipolar world centered in Wall Street and in the city of London. But this is what was attacked. The reason he was under attack was to stop the Philippines from emerging as a development center for all of Asia that would have undermined the control by the Western banking system over these countries, having free access to their raw materials, which were being literally stolen at fake prices, at manipulated international prices. And what you now see in South Korea, for instance, the kind of tremendous development that took place in South Korea under the Park government. I mean, this is what was happening in the Philippines at the time, and which was it was to be destroyed. And they put in a puppet government, which immediately shut down the nuclear power plant, shut down the food self-sufficiency program, shut down the building of a steel industry, and basically imposed an economic austerity and control policy over the country once Marcos had been gotten rid of. And it hasn't changed. I mean, the Philippines never recovered, really. I mean, there were efforts at recovery under AROP, briefly, not as powerfully, but, you know, this was an effort to begin putting together a new policy based more on the kind of development that you had under the original Marcos government. You certainly had Duterte try to do so with his development and his war on drugs. But then he became demonized, the same as Marcos had been, as a vile dictator and a drug pusher and things of this sort. But, you know, the reality is that the Philippines was already made a horrible example to the rest of the world. Don't you dare try to break from the power of the IMF and the World Bank and the Western banking system. If you do, we will crush you. And this is the message that Scott Ritter and Colonel Black and so forth reiterated in response to Cathy's question during our press conference at the press club in Washington. The U.S. is not your friend. If you submit to being a puppet to Washington in provoking a war with China, like the war with Russia that's being provoked, you will end up being thrown onto the dustbin of history by a U.S. which doesn't give a damn about your country, but they only want to use you in their geostrategic game of trying to destroy the BRICS, to destroy this upstart from the colonies who have to submit and admit that they are just colonial subjects of the world's superpower, the unipower of the world. And so this is what happened way back with the EDSA coup. You know, this was the beginning of the policy of force using the military and political intrigue to destroy any country which tried to assert sovereignty, which tried to assert a intention to develop rather than submit as a colonial subject to the Western banking system. And now it's happening again. And it's unfortunately the fact that the Marcos son, whom I met at one point, I had a chance to meet with him long before he became president. And my view at the time was that he simply did not have the vision that his father had, and that he would end up being, unfortunately, what he's become, which is just a puppet of Western leaders who are using him and using the Philippine people as a puppet in an effort to provoke a war whose purpose is the destruction of the BRICS and the destruction of China and Russia and any other country that is trying to follow in the Belt and Road policy.
Right. You mentioned, I wanted to jump off from that point, Mike. I remember in the 1970, the early 70s, 71, 72, 73, there were many things that happened, especially here in the Philippines. Kissinger's NSSM, National Security Studies Memorandum 200, I think, which declared war on populations, which include the Philippines. Essentially the global South, right? Which is a cover for like a grab of the natural resources and the wealth of the country. And then we had the change from the Bretton Woods system to a floating exchange rate system, right? And then you had number three, the petrodollar establishment. Now, this was at the start. In 1972, Marcos declared martial law. Marcos Sr. declared martial law here because the economy, I guess, was shaken. The world economy was shaken when the U.S. decided to leave the Bretton Woods system. I wanted to ask now, recently, just last week, earth-shaking development that the Saudis decided that they would not continue with the petrodollar system. And this should have been first page news in every single newspaper in the world. Now that control, you mentioned that if you don't follow the IMF, the World Bank, and such, the Bretton Woods institutions, how then does this affect? What is now the new regime, the new paradigm that we have to face of reality, because suddenly the petrodollar system is gone with the BRICS coming up, and like you said, 85% of humanity is now with the BRICS. What happens to the U.S. In that sense?
Yeah, this is very important. You may know this guy, Gilbert Doctorow. I don't know if that name rings a bell, but he's a very insightful American, but a Russia expert who understands the Russian situation very well. He responded to what you just described by the Saudis' announcement that they were no longer going to be following the policy established some 50 years ago with the U.S., where the deal was the U.S. will provide the Saudis with security protection in exchange for the Saudis promising or pledging that they would sell their oil in dollars only U.S. dollars. And that's what created the so-called petrodollar, where the value of the dollar, which was very rapidly declining internationally because of the other thing you mentioned, which is that in 1971, Nixon took the dollar off of gold and basically launched the floating exchange rate system, which was a means for looting the third world, especially by manipulating currency exchange rates and such things. This was the beginning of the end, a point at which LaRouche, immediately after Nixon made this announcement in 1971, LaRouche warned. He said, this is not just a bad economic policy. This will lead to war, to global war, to global depression and global war if it's not reversed. And of course, it was not reversed, and we're now in exactly the dire mess that LaRouche warned about back in 1971. That's the situation we're facing worldwide right now, facing world war, facing a general collapse of the dollar. The dollar is now a deteriorating, collapsing system. The world is frantically trying to get out from under the control of the dollar, both because it had been destroyed over time by this policy, but also because the U.S. began to weaponize the dollar. As you know, we began to impose sanctions on countries, claiming that we had the right to impose unilateral sanctions, which are completely illegal under the UN system. But we have the right to do it because they use our dollars in their trade. So what's the response? The countries say, well, then we won't trade in dollars anymore. And there you have the emergence of what's now being put together by the BRICS, and they have a national conference coming up in October in Kazan, Russia. Russia's the head of the BRICS this year, so the meeting is taking place in Russia. And at that conference, they will be implementing a new world financial system. Now, we're not sure how far it's going to go in the first stage, but as you already mentioned, countries are trading in local currencies rather than dollars. They're trying to get out from under the dollar as fast as they possibly can because they recognize, in the Saudis, for instance, and other countries that have large national pools of funds, sovereign funds, what they call sovereign funds, multi-billion, even hundreds of billions of dollars in funds that they've accumulated by selling their oil and so forth. But these countries recognize that what happened to Russia and Venezuela and Afghanistan when the U.S. simply stole their reserves, because everybody trusted the dollar. The dollar is as good as gold, as they used to say. So we can trust the dollar, we can put our reserves in the Western banks where they'll be safe. Well, that safety didn't exist. And that became obvious when the US began stealing, literally stealing, freezing at first, but then eventually stealing, as they are now with the Russian $300 billion that they froze, and now they're turning it over to the Ukrainians in a very complex system, which I won't try to describe right now. But the point is that they're basically just acknowledging that we took the money fair and square, we stole it, it's ours now, we can do what we want with it. Well, the result is that the world is saying, well, then we're not going to have anything to do with the dollar. So you already have the majority of trade going on, or increasing percentage, not the majority yet, but a very increasing percentage. China and Russia and their huge trade use only local currencies. They don't trade in the dollar anymore. Putin just went to Vietnam, and I think it's 70 or 80% of their trade is now done in local currencies, not dollars. And Vietnam is, I think, one of the countries applying to join the BRICS. So you have, an increasing number of countries openly aligning with Russia and China on this new currency system. And as I'm sure you've discussed with your audience in the Philippines before, and as we discussed even years ago when we used to appear regularly with you and Butch on these shows, this is a policy that comes directly from Lyndon LaRouche. In 1970, he published an article called Trade Without Currency on a basket of hard commodities. And in that article, he presented both the warning about the result of what happened in the 1971 policy of taking the dollar off of gold and allowing the floating exchange rate system to take over, warning that this was leading to economic disintegration and war, and proposed a new global financial system independent of the dollar. And the only way to do that, he said, was to have a trade system in which you used a trade currency, a currency developed only for trade. You don't try to replace the national currencies of sovereign countries, but those countries that wanted to participate in this global trade system would orient their trade to a policy of a trade currency whose value would be determined not by speculators on Wall Street or the City of London, but would be determined on a basket of commodities that would include gold, but it wasn't just a gold reserve system. It was a system in which the currencies of commodities such as gold and oil and gas and steel and other commodities would form a basket that would determine the value of the trade currency. So this idea was picked up around the world, especially by one of Russia's most brilliant economists, Sergei Glaziev. And if you don't know the name Glaziev, I suggest you jot it down and keep it in mind, because you will increasingly hear more and more about Glaziev as this year passes on, as the BRICS have their meeting in October. Glaziev had tremendous admiration for LaRouche. On LaRouche's birthday, 100th birthday, or what would have been his 100th birthday, he had died a few years before. But on that date, Glaziev gave a eulogy for LaRouche, where he basically declared him to be the greatest genius of the 20th century. And tremendously admired LaRouche's commitment to the idea of development, of human progress and development versus the policy of financial dictatorship from the Western banking system, which was really the core of the colonial system. So these policies are now being put together. Now it's starting out basically with trading in local currencies. They haven't moved to establish this new global financial system as of yet, and they may not this year, but it's moving in that direction. And this guy, Doctorow, whom I mentioned a minute ago, in a wonderful article, if you look it up, you'll see he wrote an article about the Saudi decision to break from the agreement to sell their oil in dollars only, that this marked the death knell of the dollar. That's basically what Doctorow said. And he referred back to the 1971 policy of Nixon to take the dollar off of gold, and that this was sort of this is the next step in the disintegration of the all-powerful dollar system, because it marks the most economically powerful member, and the Saudi Arabia's may or may not be a member of the BRICS. They had announced they would be a member of the BRICS, but they actually held back from implementing that policy. And right now, it's not 100% clear whether they're in or not. They did send their representative to a foreign ministers meeting of the BRICS recently in Russia. But the reason for that, and we could go into that if you wish, but the reason for that is that the Saudis were being massively pressured by the U.S., by this Biden administration, this degenerate, mentally deranged Biden administration. They were being pressured to break from the BRICS, to instead sign a new deal with Israel, and in that way solidify basically the agreement of the world to the genocide taking place by the IDF against the Palestinians, which now might expand into a full-scale war with Lebanon against the Hezbollah. That's what's liable to break out any day now. But the Saudis have obviously refused that. They've said, we will work with Israel, but only if there's a Palestinian state. And that's not something Bibi Netanyahu is going to do. Now, maybe Bibi Netanyahu is not long for his position as the Gauleiter of Israel. We'll have to see. But that's a situation which the Saudis have broken from by their declaration that they're not going to follow this dictatorship of subservience to the U.S. dollar. So this could lead very rapidly to a further disintegration of this dollar-based system, which is really the core of the colonial policy of the West, is their ability to use the dollar, to weaponize the dollar through sanctions, through wars, and so forth. So that's what's been unleashed.
Mike, to follow up on that, does it mean that the central banking system of the world is now in effect rendered inutile, or because are we looking at a return to national banking maybe?
Well, it'd be hard to answer that question because national banking is something that's determined by nations. This is something that LaRouche has long advocated, that we go back to the Hamiltonian system, where a country has not a central bank, not a bank run by private banks that control the flow of currency and so forth. This is a British system, but by a national banking system that, like Hamilton first established, and that was followed up by John Quincy Adams and others in the U.S. But that national banking system, which was the basis upon which America established itself as a leading global industrial power, is a credit policy. It's not a monetary policy. Money, as LaRouche liked to say, money is stupid. Money doesn't know anything. It's what you do with credit that determines the value of an economy and the value of its currency, not how much you can make, how much you can profit, especially by trading in currencies themselves, treating the currency itself as a commodity, which is a means of looting, of speculation. And this comes down to the issue of speculation versus investment. And the national banking policy that you're referring to is a investment policy rather than a rather than a monetary policy. The idea is to use the power of government to direct the nation's credit into long-term investments in science and technology and education and health and the general welfare. This is, of course, straight out of the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the idea of the general welfare of the population being the purpose of government, not the creating the wealth for the central bankers, but rather the investment in the long-term growth and development through science and technology and education of the citizens of the nation. This is what national banking was meant to be. Now that was sacrificed, and the U.S. lost its national banking, and we were returned to a British system of central banking, which is really what Wall Street represents. Wall Street doesn't represent the American banking system, it represents the British banking system. And it was the takeover of Wall Street by the British banking interests during the Great Depression and around that era that the U.S. got turned into basically a puppet to the British Empire. And a lot of people like to say, well, the British Empire is gone now, it's the American Empire. And there's, you can understand why people would say that, but it's not really true. The point is that the British Empire is still the center of the world financial empire of the West. It's still the city of London and the banks of the UK, which control the world financial system, using the US both as their financial Gauleiter but also as the dumb giant to use for their colonial wars. They don't go fight colonial wars anymore. They send the U.S. military in to destroy Afghanistan and destroy Iraq and to destroy Syria and Libya and so forth. So I mean, this is the world we're living in. And does this mean we can have a return to some sort of a national banking policy? Well, we certainly need to create the global infrastructure in which nations have the freedom to develop a national banking policy. And that infrastructure is what's being put together by the BRICS nations and hopefully will be implemented this October in their BRICS meeting.
LaRouche's four-power solution still applies, should apply, right? And
Sure.
do you see, I mean, is there any scenario you have an upcoming elections, assuming the elections push through in the US with everything that's happening, but so you have the leading on the polls is President Trump, and if Biden's able to run, I don't see. My comment is I don't see a return to the central bank, the petrodollar system. So, do any of those candidates in Horizon, in your mind, represent something to join the BRICS and to have a four-power solution like LaRouche proposed?
We don't have any leadership in the U.S. And I think everybody knows we don't have any leadership in the current administration. But unfortunately, as Diane Sayer repeatedly insists, who is now running for Senate in the state of New York, and in a certain sense is our presidential candidate. She's not running for president, but she's running as a presidential candidate, addressing the national interests as well as the international interests. She's doing what a real presidential candidate would do, could put it that way. But as she's insisted, none of the candidates are qualified to be president. They're not going to do what you just laid out. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Effectively, all the candidates support the wars. There's some disagreement about the Ukraine war, but there's unanimity in support of Israel in the genocide against Gaza by the so-called leading candidates. So, I mean, we're going to have this clown show on Thursday night. As I'm sure you know, there's going to be a debate between Trump and Biden, which it's really hard to imagine what's going to happen when they put poor Biden, who's obviously having very serious cognitive decay, put him up on a stage where the guy is liable to walk off the stage and fall into the audience. I mean, it's an unfortunate reality that this guy has no capacity physically and mentally to be the president of the United States, and yet they're running him as their candidate. It's really mind-boggling. And Robert Kennedy represented, everybody hoped that this would be a reflection of his uncle's presidency, of the JFK policy, which was a policy at least after the Cuban Missile Crisis and through his collaboration with Khrushchev. It represented a very hopeful moment in history, for which, of course, he was assassinated by the oligarchy, by the empire. But Robert Kennedy didn't complete that. When the Israeli war broke out, he immediately jumped to their defense, which was truly unfortunate. And whether or not he has a voice that can do anything useful, we'll see. Trump is, his problem was that when he was president before, he had no political machine. He was never in politics. He was a businessman, an investor in real estate. And as a result, he ended up appointing people who hated him to run the military policy, especially, and his foreign policy. And as a result, the only person, this guy Flynn, was the only person who agreed with him in any degree on really essential issues, including the fact that Flynn was exposing the fact that the U.S. was financing Al-Qaeda and the terrorist networks in the Middle East. We were financing the people who had done 9/11 to the United States, but we were financing them to help overthrow Saddam Hussein and then Gaddafi and then the attempt to overthrow Assad in Syria. All this was done, and Flynn exposed the fact that this was being done with the U.S. arming these terrorists, just as we're arming the Israeli terrorists right now. But he was immediately thrown out. I mean, he was subjected to, what they now call, well, it was a Watergate type operation where he was demonized by the media, accused of being a Russian puppet because he talked to the Russians. Anybody who wants to have diplomacy and actually talk to the Russians is declared to be an enemy of the people and a puppet of Putin, and this kind of thing that you see all over now. The first case of this was what they did to Flynn. And the rest of his administration were people who didn't agree with anything he thought at best, in his best moments. And there's no indication that that's going to be any different this time around. Now, he did say something useful the other day. Somebody brought up the idea that Biden had said that the world is facing a huge crisis in climate change, that this is a threat to civilization. And his response was quite astute. He said, well, I suppose climate change could lead to the sea levels rising by 1/8 of an inch in 50 years. And that would probably change the amount of seaside real estate available to a certain layer of people. But that's not a great threat to civilization. I'll tell you what is a threat to civilization: nuclear weapons. So Trump said this. He didn't elaborate. He didn't point out that we're dealing here with a nuclear policy openly being developed in the West in preparation for a first strike against the Russians. And if I'm sure you've discussed this in your program before, but in the last couple of months, the U.S. Through Ukraine, the U.S. who runs Ukraine lock, stock, and barrel, not only was running this Nazi attack against the Russian-speaking people within Ukraine, but began attacking within the Russian territory itself, not just the areas that had joined Russia within Ukraine, but began crossing the border. And then just a couple of weeks ago, openly attacked Russia's radar system. The radar system, which is their eyes and ears on the threat of nuclear war, the only system they have. They don't have a satellite system, which they plan on building, but they don't have one now. They depend upon this land radar, which is their only means of warning of a possible attack against the Russian state. And the Ukraine, using U.S. weapons, bombed a couple of these radar sites. They did some damage on one and potentially could knock it out. And this is, if you look at this from the Russian point of view, if you put yourself in Russia's position, here's the U.S. sending F-16s into Ukraine, which are nuclear-capable bombers, deploying missiles in Romania and Bulgaria, which can easily attack Moscow as quickly as the weapons could have attacked the U.S. from Cuba when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. and then they start taking out their early warning system. So what do they see? They say they're preparing for a first strike against Russia. This is what we see being done. And they warned that they're aware and that they are, let me remind you, Putin said over and over again, let me remind you that we are a major nuclear power. We have a nuclear doctrine, which is defensive in nature. But if we see our country, our nation, the existence of the Federation, the Russian Federation, is threatened, then we have the right to use our nuclear weapons. This then was called saber rattling, and the Russians are planning nuclear war. Well, the point is they see the West preparing a first strike where the Russians know that the strategic thinkers in the West have this false idea that we have the capacity to take out a counterstrike of the Russians. We can knock out their ability to respond to an attack, which is not true. I mean, they have submarines, they have means of responding. But in any case, this is what they see being prepared by the NATO forces. Not only has the West moved their NATO up to their border, which they were attempting to do by getting Ukraine into NATO, to make it even worse than it is now, but they're still already on their border. But they're now preparing for a potential first strike. And this is what the Russians have to respond to. And nobody's talking. What do they say over and over again? They won't talk to us. There's no negotiation. There's no diplomacy. This is something that Scott Ritter and Colonel Black and Colonel Wilkerson really emphasized, is that diplomacy has been destroyed in the West. We don't want to talk to the Russians or the Chinese, really. There's some talk with the Chinese going on now. But by and large, diplomacy has been outlawed, as insanely as it was by Zelensky, who literally passed a law saying negotiations with Russia is a crime. There shall be no talk to the Russians. We will not talk. There shall be no peace negotiations. We're going to win this war, which of course is an impossibility. But this is the same, basically the same policy being followed by the US and by NATO. No negotiation. We are the unipolar, single power in the world. People will obey us or else. And if it means a nuclear war, so be it. This is the insanity that we're living with right now and the danger that we're living with.
Mike, given what's happening, I think it seems, and you will correct me if I'm wrong. It might be very superficial, but as the Western financial system collapses and disintegrates, which LaRouche and the organization has been warning to already for decades, but now it seems the catalyst or the might be that end of the petrodollar. There may be an increase in there may be an escalation, another round of escalation to war. I'm sure the tremendous pressure on our president, the tremendous pressure on our president is palpable. What can he do at this point to de-escalate or to not be led, sleepwalking into a conflict with China?
President Marcos, you're talking about.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what Scott Ritter said is absolutely true. The Philippines has to recognize that if they allow themselves to be used as a surrogate war against China, that they'll be destroyed, and the U.S. will not come to their defense. You can talk all you want about the treaty agreement between the Philippines and the U.S. with the U.S. assuring that they'll defend them. And as I'm sure you know, our leaders over the last couple of years have been saying, any attack on a Philippine ship anywhere in the South China Sea or anywhere in the world we will consider to be an attack that falls under our treaty agreement. Well, don't count on it. The U.S. is not going to move in and defend the Philippines in this situation, except in the same way that they're, quote, defending Ukraine. They're not defending Ukraine. They're driving Ukraine to suicide. And they will drive the Philippines to suicide if there's a war. God forbid that there should be a war with China, the one country which has the capacity to develop all of Southeast Asia, as they are developing most of the world with the Belt and Road. You know, this is the one country in the world which is countering the IMF World Bank policy, which basically says the only money that we're going to give you is money to refinance your debts at higher interest rates, and you do what we say. The Chinese are coming in like America used to come in and say, what do you need to become a modern country? What kind of infrastructure do you need? You can use our model, where we built the greatest infrastructure boom in the history of the human race over a very short period of time, 30 or 40 years. We built, what, 55,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, nuclear power plants. They're building a couple of fusion reactors, massive ports, bridges, basic infrastructure. What's the result? The result is 8 million people lifted out of poverty. 800 million. Let me correct myself. 800 million people lifted out of poverty in China alone. And this is the policy that they're taking to the rest of the world through the Belt and Road. It's a policy that Marcos his father was developing before he was thrown out in the color revolution run by Schultz and Wolfowitz and Colonel and Cardinal Sin and his allies. This is what they're doing now on a global scale, which is why they're hated. This is why they're hated by the so-called West, which is that they're taking away, and they say this, that they're trying to take away our world leadership, say the spokespeople for the neoconservatives. Well, they are trying to take away their global leadership. That's true. It doesn't mean they want to rule the world. They don't have any interest in ruling the world, but they are offering development rather than economic austerity and subservience to a colonial system. They're basically saying, what infrastructure do you need to become an industrial country? How can we end the colonial era once and for all that we've been living under for 500 to 600 years by actually turning the African and Asian and South American countries into modern industrial nations with modern trade, with modern ports, with modern transportation, with industry. These are the policies being followed by the Belt and Road and that are being increasingly adopted by the BRICS through the New Development Bank, their banking system, which has had a slow start, but which is now run by Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil, who's had a long meeting with Putin at the recent St. Petersburg meeting, that the New Development Bank has the potential of actually being what the IMF and the World Bank claimed they were, which was banks whose purpose was the development of the third world, not the further indebting of the third world and the debt collection operation of the City of London and Wall Street, but a development bank to actually bring about that kind of development that leads to the transformation of former colonies into modern industrial nations. So that's
Okay. So
what the Philippines has to do. I mean, are they going to do it? Is this government going to do it? I would be interested in hearing what you think of the intention is of Sara Duterte for resigning her cabinet positions. Do you think this means there's going to be a revolt against the Marcos policy?
Yeah, I think that's already implied. And the many sectors are positioning her as the opposition. Although personally, we have yet to hear her views on certain topics and certain issues, especially the more important ones, such as this. So it's a wait and see, but she has a following, and she has a very strong base, which is circles around her father also. But in terms of and so she has that, and she's demonstrated in the past that she's willing to work with China and the rest. So she's not sort of dragged into this intramurals and the narrative that they're saying about the West Philippine Sea versus the China Sea. So it's a wait and see for us in terms of Sarah and what she wants to do. And we're open as long as the right principles are applied. And if it were up to us, we'd apply to BRICS tomorrow. If we had any say in the matter, we would apply as a member of BRICS tomorrow.
Yes.
And work as we like to reference what LaRouche said, the Titanic has struck the iceberg long ago, and it's time to realize that we should go into the lifeboats. There's a question from Ver regarding this, and I want to add to it. His question was about nuclear war, and it seems incredulous that there are people who will want to destroy civilization as we know it. And I want to add to that Ver's question about is it a real possibility that Russia will actually use, if provoked, will actually use nuclear weapons? And are there still factions within the U.S. military and the war hawks around them that think they can win a nuclear conflict, a full-scale nuclear conflict, and why?
Yes, there are. They're so far confined to a few total lunatics in the Congress and a few other spokesmen here and there who quite openly say we should start a nuclear war. We can win it. That level of insanity has not become policy as of yet. But as we can see, the idea that we cannot lose our role as the unipower lords of the universe, what they sometimes call the essential country. I think Biden uses that terms. We're the necessary country. We are the power which keeps the world safe for democracy. This is when he's using this wild thing about democracy versus autocracy. The world is no longer the free world versus communism as it was under the old communist regimes. So we have to use the word democracy versus autocracy against, China and Russia and the other autocratic countries. This is the passage, the phrase that's used for brainwashing people, for getting people to accept the idea that we have to put aside diplomacy. Diplomacy is old-fashioned. We need to declare our lordship over the world and prepare for war. But there's no question but that they're preparing for war. Vucic, the head of Serbia, actually said he thinks there's going to be a war in 3 to 5 months in Europe. That's how close we are. You have leaders of NATO saying we have to prepare, leaders of Germany saying we have to prepare our nation for war within a few years at most. And that means building munitions on our border, but it also means preparing our hospitals for dealing with casualties. I mean, this is the level of sickness where all that's required is to do exactly what Putin proposed in his June 14th speech. Negotiate, sit down, let's work out a deal like we worked out in March and April of 2022, right? I'm sure you know this story. You know, soon after the special military operation began, when the Russians moved into Ukraine, the Ukrainians were willing to negotiate, and there were negotiations that took place first in Belarus and then in Ankara in Turkey. And they came to an agreement. They had a signed or an initialed agreement to basically grant. This was before they had the votes in the Donbass and the other regions of Ukraine, the votes to join Russia. So these were still officially part of Ukraine, these areas. But the agreement would assure they had the right to use the Russian language, and these were mostly Russian-speaking people in that area of Ukraine, that they had the right to security, that there would be no more bombardment of these regions by the Kiev regime, that they would pledge not to join NATO. I mean, you know, this is a 800-kilometer border or more than that, I forget. You know, to have U.S. and NATO bases along that border with Russia. This is the border where the Second World War was fought, where the Russians lost 27 million people. You know, they cannot tolerate that any more than the U.S. could tolerate Russian nuclear weapons in Cuba. So that this agreement would have assured that they would not join NATO, that the Donbass oblasts would be autonomous, but they'd be part of Ukraine. They wouldn't be separate. So that was an agreement that both sides agreed to. It was a difficult negotiation, but at that point, the leaders in Ukraine recognized that they better not have a war that killed everybody. But unfortunately, as you know, the famous story, Boris Johnson, Bojo, hopped on a plane and flew into Kiev and said, no, you're not going to sign any deal. We need a war. We need you to keep fighting to the last Ukrainian to help decrease Russia's power. And they gave in. So as a result, how many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have died? The infrastructure of the country has been destroyed. The nation is a Nazi hellhole, no democracy. In fact, Zelensky's not even the president anymore. As I'm sure you know, the constitution in Ukraine gives a limit to how long he could stay in office, and that limit ran out this month. And as a result, he's officially not even the president anymore. So, I mean, the situation is a drastic one. And basically, Putin said, let's use that as the basis for negotiation, for diplomacy, and let's end this war. But there's no one to talk to, because not only will Ukraine not talk, or at least not publicly, not officially, but nobody in the West will talk. There's no negotiation going on. Biden never met with Putin, never talked to Putin since this war began. Blinken has nothing to do with LaRouche or with anybody. There's no negotiation. Diplomacy is a thing of the past. The superpower doesn't need diplomacy. The superpower imposes its will. And that means mass death. And if it means we're threatened with losing our role as the world's essential government as the unipolar world, we'll go to war. If it's a nuclear war, it'll be a nuclear war. That's the insanity of the leadership that we're dealing with. And the reason, as Harley said in his statement that you played at the beginning, said it's up to the population to stand up. People have to decide that they're not going to sit back and watch the human race destroyed, watch civilization destroyed, as would happen in a nuclear war. They're going to take their own personal role as a human being with the creative power of reason, created in the image of God. What distinguishes us from the animals is our ability to reason and to solve problems that have been created by mankind. We can solve those problems, but it means that we have to act as citizens of the world, each and every one of us, and take responsibility for the future of the human race.
Okay, one last follow-up question before we ask you to give your final statement, Mike. The ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nations doesn't seem to be supportive of the Philippines. The Philippines stance against China, or the Philippines stance that is painting China as the aggressor. Is it because they understand the situation, or is that the influence of the United States within these countries has waned and they've shifted? Because I heard, like you mentioned, Vietnam might be joining the BRICS, and Thailand, I think I heard, also might be interested in joining the BRICS. So
And Malaysia.
So these big countries in Southeast Asia have already gone to the lifeboats or chosen the new international economic system over forever wars. How influential still is the U.S. Besides the Philippines in this part of the world?
Well, I think that's up in the air right now. I mean, the U.S. is sending one of their deputy secretaries to Vietnam, literally days after Putin was in Vietnam, at which point, he reasserted a very strong tie between Russia and Vietnam. This was after his historic visit to Pyongyang. And I think you've probably discussed this already, but Putin's agreement in North Korea was really quite profound. Putin had earlier said that if the West continues this policy of sending offensive weapons, not only sending them to Ukraine, but telling Ukraine to go ahead and use them against sites deep within the Russian territory, that why don't we have the right to send such offensive weapons to the countries that consider themselves adversaries of the United States? And that's exactly what happened with North Korea. They basically signed a mutual defense agreement. This is the only defense pact that Russia has with any country in the world, but it's with North Korea. And essentially said that they can provide offensive weapons to the North Koreans. Ray McGovern, in our International Peace Coalition meeting last Friday, said that he said he could reveal, I think this is something we didn't know, but he said the Russians provided North Korea with an ICBM several years ago. An ICBM which was not the very best that the Russians had, but it was number 2. It certainly has the capacity to hit anywhere in the United States. It's a mobile system. It's solid fuel. So this has already happened, according to Ray, and he's probably right. He's usually right on these things. I mean, this is what happened in North Korea. And then in Vietnam, basically a similar reestablishment of very close collaboration, economic as well as strategic. Now the U.S. is sending one of their flunkies in there to try to reassert U.S. Vietnamese strategic agreements and importance and so forth. But it's going nowhere. I mean, it's what you just indicated. These countries recognize that China is their number one trade partner. All of ASEAN, China is their number one trade partner. And that the ASEAN policy of not interfering in each other's internal affairs has been sort of the bedrock of ASEAN from the beginning. It's been tested by what's happening in Myanmar because so many countries are angry about the military coup in Myanmar, and they passed resolutions, which even that goes beyond their non-interference policy. But I think that's what's behind their not saying much publicly anyway about what's going on in the Philippines. But I mean, these are intelligent nations, intelligent leaders. Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, these are countries that recognize that the danger of a war with China is huge. It would be devastating for all of Asia, all of the world, but especially all of Asia. They've been through wars before under the U.S., the Vietnam War, which was Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and so forth. Mass destruction, genocidal mass killing. And they certainly don't want to see another one. But they don't want to interfere, I guess, in the internal affairs in the Philippines. So again, it's up to the citizens of the Philippines to stand up as you are through the Philippine LaRouche Society and the Katipunan to, basically assert sanity against the insanity which is leading to this threat of war with Russia and China.
Okay, Mike, so we have about 20 minutes left. I'd like to, before we say goodbye, I'd like to ask to mainly final message to the Filipino people as a great and good friend to the Filipinos over decades. Same with the late Gail Billington, who had been working with us and collaborating with us since long ago. And also maybe invite people to go to check out Schiller Institute, and also to join the Zooms of, let's say, the International Peace conference that you're promoting. Go ahead, Mike. I'll give you the floor.
Well, the International Peace Coalition meetings, which have been 55 every week now for over a year, has developed into a very prominent institutional structure. The idea was to bring peace movements from around the world together, of different ideologies, people with different strategic outlooks, but that they concur that we have to stop this insane drive towards nuclear war. And it's been quite effective. So that meeting is on 11 o'clock Eastern time, the New York time, every Friday. That's 11 o'clock p.m. your time on Friday night, which is late, but it's usually goes for an hour and a half or so. So it's not so late that you can't stay up. And I encourage people to get on board. I'll send you the link. Well, I guess you get the link already, right? You get it from us. You can send it out to the people watching this program on your chat. But I do encourage people to join us. This is especially given that you have the important role that the Philippines has been thrust into now as a result of this push for war with China. And the dramatic intervention that you yourselves made with Cathy's question at the press conference, which led to these very powerful responses. So as on a personal note, I will thank you for thanking Gail, my late wife, who was one of the people who, you know, helped establish our very close relationship with the Philippines, and which I followed up as much as I could, several visits to your late and beloved father, Butch, and to your continuing work in that policy, in that spokesman for the LaRouche movement within the Philippines, and for your own national interests. So I will mention that something we used to talk about regularly, because Lynn used to say that he had a sort of a soft spot in his heart for the Philippines, because the Philippines represents both the Western and the Eastern cultures, partially because of the colonial past of the Spanish and the American colonial era. There are obvious huge problems brought about by that kind of colonial policy, which has been overthrown. But on the other hand, it brought a certain amount of Western Christian culture into the Philippines. And at the same time, it's very much an Asian nation. So it's a bridge. It's a bridge between East and West, and an important bridge. A bridge which, if there is peaceful cooperation between the United States and developing countries, if we can provoke within the American population a sense of love for other cultures, the Peace of Westphalia view that if there's going to be peace, it's going to be based on honoring the interests of the others, of the so-called enemies or potential enemies, but recognizing that you have to honor the security and the right to development of the others as well as yourself, that this is the only basis on which you can stop this drive for war. As Helga likes to say, the Peace of Westphalia was a long process, many years of negotiations, but they recognized that if they didn't come to some settlement of the religious wars that was tearing Europe apart for 100 years, 150 years, and the 30 Years' War that sort of concluded that if that wasn't resolved, that there wouldn't be anybody left to glory in their victory. And this is, in a nuclear age, this is emphatically true. There won't be anybody left. So we have to come to this peace. We have to come to an agreement which depends upon mobilizing people to act like human beings, to act as they're created in the image of God. That these are issues that are within our power to resolve as human beings, and that we have to do it. Each and every one of us has to take that responsibility ourselves. So this is the importance of the historic U.S.-Philippines relations and the LaRouche movement's special relationship with those of you in the Philippines who have built up this idea of the Philippine LaRouche movement. So I thank you very much. Very good to have been on again after years, and in memory of Butch and Gail and others who have gone before us. Let us continue this task.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Mike. It's nice to see you and nice to hear from you again, your voice. And we thank you for being a constant friend of the Philippines. Besides a personal friend of the family and of the movement, and on behalf of Bear and Cathy, thank you very much for joining us. We'll have you back again soon. Lots of things happening in the world. And I think, as usual, the LaRouche movement, the LaRouche organization, is at the forefront of providing the best ideas moving forward of how the world can shape the future for the benefit of all humanity. Please give our best regards to Helga and everybody there, the crew, the gang, in the LaRouche organization. And maybe some of them can come on also soon, because there's so many things happening, and I think the Filipinos have been the crack of the mainstream media propaganda wall has been broken by Scott Ritter in his fashion, right? But it's great because now they can see that there is an alternative view to these things, and it gives strength to our institutions here and personalities here in the Philippines because of you guys.
It'd be good if you could get Diane Sayer on your program.
Well,
She's running as an independent candidate. She's very close to Scott Ritter. She was one of the people who helped recruit Scott to our efforts. And it would be very good to have her and Jose Vega, who's running for Congress in New York State, along with Diane's candidate for Senate. But they're very much international candidates. So they, I think, have a big impact on Filipinos hearing what they're doing in the U.S.
Sure, we'll get on that, and I very much love to have them on and get their thoughts and meet the Filipinos, so the Filipinos can meet them as well. Well, Mike, I will let you go. I know it's early morning in the U.S., about 9 o'clock, I think, in your time. It was so nice seeing you while we close the show. You can stay on in the background if you want us to hear us close the show, or you can. But it's very nice to have you. And Cathy, Ver, and I are very privileged to still have you around and remind us of what we should be doing for our mission in the world.
Well, I hope we're helping the rest of the world see what you're continuing to do there.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. Thank you.
Okay, good. So long.
Bye-bye. Kat?
Yeah. It's already 8:51 na po ng gabi, Philippine Standard Time, at kayo po ay nakikinig pa rin dito sa himpilan ng RMN XL 558 kHz AM band, at sabayan niyo po kaming napapanood sa pamamagitan ng Katipunan Channel. Nako, ang daming mga mahalagang impormasyon ang ibinahagi sa atin, no? Itos ni Mike Billington at
Yes.
oo, yes.
Sige.
Pero ito yung maganda lang, Itos, no? Bagamat may nagtutulak ng pandaigdigang digmaan gamit ang Pilipinas, Ukraine at iba pang mga bansa laban sa Russia at China, may maliwanag na hakbang na pwedeng pagpilian ang liderato ng ating bansa at ang sambayan ng Pilipino patungo sa kapayapaan at kaunlaran. Hindi lamang actually ang ating bansa, kundi ang buong mundo, di ba, Itos?
Correct.
Yun
Nobody
yung
wants war. Walang may
Yes.
gusto ng gera.
Correct.
Pero sabi nga yung LaRouche and with Mike Billington and everybody there, Helga and Lyndon and everybody here dito, alam naman natin we've been fighting this for so long, diba?
Yeah.
And we've been fighting for a new world renaissance.
Mm.
And everything that's happening now in the world is leading towards that. This is another transition point or inflection point in the world events. And personally, although the danger of war is very imminent, there's also a very real opportunity to move towards a new world renaissance, a real renaissance, and that's what Mike Billington, yun po yung sinasabi ni Mike Billington sa atin. Pero tayo dapat, we should create that, we should help that along. Yan ang mensahe po. That's Mike's message to all of us. Tayo po ang citizens. We as citizens must take on the responsibility to help our country change and to help our country be set in the right direction. Hindi po responsibilidad lang ng mga liderato natin. We have to convince our leadership that this is the path we want. This is what we reject. We reject war. We reject non-development. We reject the culture of death. And let's choose life, and let's choose new world renaissance. Let's get out of Plato's cave.
Yeah.
And inform everybody. Show them what the source of the real light is or knowledge is. So that's Yun po yung kailangan natin gawin. Yun yung mensahe. So for those who didn't catch, because syempre, Mike, it's English, and you can watch the show again. And next week we will delve down into this, and Cathy and I will drill down into what Mike was telling us, and aside also from Harley, and we will try to invite more prominent international opinion makers and from the LaRouche movement and otherwise, just to shed light and to give the Philippines a broader perspective of that there is a group out there, there are groups out there that represent humanity and do not and reject the notion that there will be forever wars. Diba, Kat?
Correct. You're right, Itos. At talagang mag-isip-isip na po tayo, sambayan ng Pilipino. Sabi nga ni Scott Ritter, wake up, Filipino people.
Oh, grow up daw. We should grow up.
Grow up, wake up. Parang awa nyo na, hindi po maganda ang kahihinatnan, hindi lang po ng bansang Pilipinas, kundi ng buong mundo, sakaling mangyari ang isang nuclear war. At pinakita na po namin yan dito sa himpilan na to. Dito po mismo sa Katipunan Channel. At makikita nyo, mag-isip-isip po kayo. Baka akala nyo, laro po itong nangyayari. Hindi po ito laro. Kaya makinig po kayo. So, with that, Itos, maraming salamat. Talagang very fruitful ang ating pinagtalakayan ngayon with Mike Billington. Thank you, Itos. With that, tayo ay 2 minuto na lang mga nalalabi at sa pangalan po ng Katipunan ng palatuntunan ito at sa pamunuan po ng Radio Mindanao Network, DZXL at Katipunan Channel, lalo na po sa magagaling na transmitter engineers and technicians, mga broadcast technicians po natin sa loob at labas ng himpilan po ng DZXL, kay Ver Chibido, maraming salamat, kay Engineer Dominador Abogado, kila Valentin Velasica, kay Ray Albesa, of course, kay Erwin Makatangay, kay Cecilio Valencio, kay Alex Abilon Sr., kay Chris Narvaez Jr., at syempre kay Daniel Fagonilo, at kay Richard Ramirez. Maraming salamat sa pag-alalay niyo sa amin at 10 ng pamunuan po ng RMN DZXL. Maraming salamat po. Kami po ay pansamantalang nagpapaalam at nagpapasalamat na sinamahan ninyo kami ang Hora de Peligro ng ating bayan at ng buong mundo. Hanggang sa linggo po muli mga katipon, alas 7 hanggang alas 9 ng gabi. Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat.
Inyong napakinggan si Itos Valdes kasama si Cathy Cruz at iba pang katipon na nakilahok sa talakayan.
Ating Katipunan.
Samahang muli si Itos Valdes sa susunod na linggo alas 7 hanggang alas 9 ng gabi sa himpilan ng RMN DZXL 558 kHz AM band at social media accounts ng Partido KDP.
Ating Katipunan.